Even with good information, reserve planning often faces resistance. We often hear reactions like, "We'll deal with it later," "It's too expensive," or "Owners won't support it." But refusing to address ongoing deterioration only makes the inevitable outcome more expensive. Throughout this portion of our Psychology of Reserves webinar, we walk through the most common objections boards face and how to respond in a way that keeps your association moving forward. With a firm grasp on the financial realities, boards are better equipped to lead their communities forward into a financially stable future.
So let's talk about hard to interpret. Is a reserve study hard to interpret, Brian?
Well, again, we're getting to the next level of resistance.
Yeah.
If we don't have a reserve study, fine, we'll do it ourselves. Okay, fine, that doesn't sound like a good idea. Well, if we get a reserve study, we're not going to even understand what it says. We're just going to put it on the shelf because it's too hard to interpret. But when we put a reserve study together, as you can see on the next slide, this is how we try to present all the data so that it can be digested in a short time frame. So this is a lot of numbers, but I can truly walk you through it in less than 3 minutes. So on the front of our reserve study, you're going to see we have the starting balance for this association, right? This hypothetical association. That's how much money they have in reserves. Their fully funded reserve balance is $3.6 million. So you go, whoa, that sounds like a big number. We divide those two numbers together and we see that this association is 16% funded. So they're in the red. Okay, so right now I've already found out that the association has this much money. The fully funded balance, or the accumulated value of deterioration, is this 3.6 in this particular case. Therefore, currently their risk levels or their financial health levels are lower. Their risk is high and their health for financials is low. Okay, so then what do we do with that? Well, based on the reserve study recommendations, we are saying transfer into the reserve account about $670,000. Okay, that's the data point that we need to go for. And so then the question will be, well, okay, what are we doing now? Well, you can see in the bottom of the gray box right there, it says the most recent annual reserve transfer rate is $669,000. Okay, so I've tried to say there, based on all the data, this property had, let's just say, hundreds and hundreds of components, but we were able to distill all the information onto one page by saying, here's how much money the association has. So here's their starting point. Okay. Then we're able to say, why? Why do they need money? Well, based on the accumulated value deterioration for this association, they have about $3.6 million of accumulated deterioration. Therefore, currently, they're at a lower percent funded, meaning they currently don't have funding. However, the road that they need to take, the path that they need to take, the directions they need to follow are to just stay the course, increase slightly their reserve transfers, and they're going to be in a good position, right? So if that's something that you're afraid of presenting at a board meeting, we are able to explain this very quickly. Of course, there's always going to be someone who's available to explain that to you. If you're ever concerned or confused, give me a quick call, email. We can make a very quick video that explains your data, just like I did here, very briefly. But then you might get a question that says, well, what's the percent funded? And so let me show you how we want to interpret the percent funded on the next slide. Percent funded is a way for us to assess the financial health of the association. So on that last slide, you saw it was 16.7% funded. It might sound scary, but the goal of the reserve study is not to create some sort of morality or judgment, moral judgment on the association or the board or how they did things. Rather, we're just saying currently, here's where you're at today, okay? So the percent funded is just a statistical tool that we utilize to show current financial health. So what we have found is that when associations are at 30% funded and below, statistically speaking, they're at a higher risk of special assessment risks. Whereas when you are at 70% funded and above, that risk drops to less than 1% to have those same sort of risks. However, this is not a moral judgment. So when I go to the doctor, I use this example and I get my blood pressure checked. If I'm a little bit over the normal range, let's say I'm like 130 over 100 or something like that, is that a moral judgment on my health? Or is it potentially I had too much coffee that morning, or maybe you need to go running a bit more, something like that? It is not a moral judgment that I'm a good or bad person. It's just that I need to make some maybe minor adjustments or some tweaks because I'm currently in a higher risk or elevated risk range. The same thing is with your percent funded. Don't get distracted by, hey, we're poorly funded or well-funded. Well-funded being, hey, we don't have to do anything. We're so good. Don't worry about it. Or we're poorly funded. I'm so embarrassed. I can't present this data. Rather, just understand if you're concerned or you're confused about what this all means. It's a simple email and it can be explained for you very clearly so that if you start to feel that fear of presenting this at an annual meeting, we can give you the really quick tools or the really quick phrases that help explain that so that it's no longer hard to interpret. It's no longer confusing. It's just very simple data.
I've never heard anyone explain being 16% funded so eloquently so that people leave with the right measure of concern for the future, but not hopelessness and antagonism. And that's what it's all about, right? Which is giving adults good information, credible information, and including them in this decision that the community will ultimately have to make now and in the future. One of the things that comes up to me a lot, and I'm sure it does to Brian, is this reserve study numbers are too expensive, right? We understand it, but there's no way we can fund that. And the genesis of this class came from a class we were teaching on a Saturday somewhere in Colorado. And the sincere board member who was a little frustrated piped up and said, I don't know why you'd give us these numbers. We don't have the money. We'll never have the money. We're never going to fund in accordance with the study. So why bother? Somebody may lose their home. Brian's going to re-anchor that effectively.
Right. And this reminds me of me I don't like going to the doctor. So my wife has to generally remind me.
Let me just say, Brian's response to that real time was, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah. So it is true. There's been times where I have like a fever or something like that. And I say, hey, Steph, which is my wife, I'm just going to wait this one out. I think I'll be okay because I don't want to pay the copay. I think I'll be fine. I think I take some ibuprofen. And so what I'm essentially saying is like, I prefer not to go to the doctor. If I'm actually having like appendicitis, we'll deal with it at that point. However, that's a very poor way of structuring that problem, right? If I would just go to the doctor now, see if I can take some antibiotics or see if I need to go do some more preventative measures, I'm going to save myself a lot of money because a simple doctor visit is going to be much cheaper than a trip to the urgent care. Not that I have any experience having to wait until 12 o'clock at night to go to the urgent care. It's just I found out that bill is not cheap, right? So we want to think through this. It is something that you may say, now this looks too expensive. We can't worry about it. So I'm just going to defer it. But unfortunately, that's not going to be helpful whatsoever. And so if you get that pushback, okay, we don't want to reserve say, okay, well, you need to get one. Okay, well, we'll do it ourselves. Well, that's not the right choice to do. Okay, well, fine. Even if we get it, it doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. It's very cumbersome. Okay, fine. But the numbers don't make any sense. It's just too expensive, right? We're trying to track the following arguments you're going to get. Well, let me remind the board members and the owners that funding your reserves is not too expensive, right? As David mentioned, it's anchoring. If you think your reserve transfers per month should be $100 a month, for example, but they really should be like $300 per month, we have to re-anchor that. And so one way I have found to be helpful for re-anchoring that is just looking at how much does it cost per day for an owner that lives in your property. And what we found is that it's relatively affordable depending on what you're comparing it to. So I went to Starbucks the other day. I got a small cup of drip coffee and it was about $3.50 to get a small cup of drip coffee from Starbucks. And so interestingly, what we found is that for an average well-funded or a well-funded association that can take care of their association's assets on an ongoing basis, it's about $3 to $5 per day per unit, $3 to $5 per day per unit. And so the argument here then is, look, we're not saying give up your cup of coffee and just put it into reserves. I understand a cup of coffee gives you that immediate joy. However, we're saying that if you have an owner that says, we can't afford this, the response back should be, well, we can, just we don't want to, right? And that's a different conversation. We just don't want to afford this. It is something that we can put money into. We can make a difference in our reserves. We can put our feet one foot in front of the other and actually go towards a positive direction. We just have to change the way that we look at the problem. It is not too expensive. It's just that we don't want to spend the money. So the thing that we also then need to keep in mind is if it's too expensive today, it's going to be much more expensive next year. And so what are we seeing then from a cost basis for your associations? Well, there's two factors that we have to be aware of whenever we push a project aside or defer a project's replacement. One of them is going to be just the scope of work increases over time. So if we have like a minor painting and repair project, that might turn into a full replacement project. So we have a $2 square foot project moving to about $20 to $25 a square foot. So massive cost increase due to deferring a project, a simple project that's going to cost the association, all the owners, a lot of money. Additionally, the longer that we wait to complete a project, inflation is now going to impact the cost of that project. And so this is a really helpful index that I look at. It's the Mortenson Construction Cost Index. And as you can see, in 2025 alone, we experienced about a 7.5% increase in construction materials. So this is just an index, meaning it's not exactly your association's, whatever it may be, but it's helpful to remember for the Colorado area, in Denver particularly. And this, they also track nationally if you want to look on their website. It's just helpful to see, wow, costs are increasing. And you can see that bump from 2020 to 2021. I mean, things are really going up in price. So if, again, the response is it's too expensive, we can't afford it, well, we have to make a choice because it's only going to be more expensive the longer that we wait.
Yeah, and the response might be, and we wouldn't say it necessarily this bluntly, but the project determines the price. The price will be paid. And when we talk about it's too expensive, we're arguing with reality because the real estate deteriorates on a pretty predictable schedule. And when we argue with reality, we usually lose, right? So that, it's too expensive is just a fantasy. It is what it is. And I wouldn't say that either in a public meeting, but we have to be aware that the project will determine the price, and that price will be paid for people to live in these homes. And to Brian's way of talking about this, we don't need to win today. We don't need to win this year. We just have to start. And the psychology is loss aversion, right? People feel losses twice as acutely as they feel equivalent gains. All of us, not every human on earth, but as a general rule, we are much more attuned to feeling loss acutely than we are to feeling gain. And we also put off things in the future, right? Whether it's our health, our teeth, car payment, our retirement. We want immediate savings over future cost savings, right? And you look at associations and you look at the federal government, we all want lower taxes, we all want more services, and that's just mathematically impossible. So this idea of how can we save $5 this year? Well, you could, but it might be $7.50 the following year that you'll have to pay with the construction cost index and the scope of the project creeping due to Band-Aids. And it's pretty common that boards, managers, humans save money by doing repairs, right? And that's usually the life cycle of any component that has the ability to be repaired. Let's do the repairs. Brian?
Right, exactly. Okay, we've come to the reality. These are the costs. These are what they are. We just heard that we can't defer it or we can't push it aside because it's just going to get worse and more expensive. We're seeing that costs aren't slowing down. So can we just do it in pieces, or can we just do some Band-Aids and some minor repairs because we just don't have the money? We can't do this, and we can't potentially, or we don't want to because we're afraid of our board meeting. We're afraid of our annual meeting, of what's going to happen. So I understand this again, right? We're saying these things not from an ivory tower. We're saying these things because we've seen these in real time during board meetings where we know how hard and potentially stressful it can be. So again, we're trying to give you the answers so that when you're faced with these sorts of dilemmas, how do you respond in an effective way? So again, if the question then says, okay, well, can't we just repair some of these things or phase these things over time? Won't that just be a better way of doing it? Can we just save some money that way? If you go back, actually, that one right there.
Okay.
This is helpful for you to think about as far as when you get that question visually, can we just repair over time? So when we get our percent funded, the math behind it, as I showed you on that previous slide, was we take what do you have in your reserves as of the fiscal year start date, divide it by the fully funded balance, which is the accumulated value of deterioration. So the accumulated value of deterioration or the fully funded balance, this is how the math works, okay? So if we just replace the component this year, it is 1 year old. And if we have a component that should last 10 years and it currently costs $10,000, in order to be keeping pace with the rate of deterioration or 100% funding this particular component in year one, we should have about $1,000 in reserves to be keeping pace with that rate of deterioration. So as you can see, it matches the rate of deterioration as the years progress. So in year 10, we say, okay, we don't want to spend the money. Rather, we're just going to repair it. So we spend maybe, I don't know, $500. We're just going to repair it. $500. The next year, $500. Well, now we actually still need to replace this component, but we've already spent an additional $1,000 just to repair to keep it going by, right? Just to keep it going, excuse me. So in year 12, we still have to pay the potentially $10,000, but we've already put in an additional $1,000. So we've increased the total cost of the project because we've just band-aided it over time. But remember, I showed you in a few slides ago, inflation is impacting all of these costs on the association's property. So we've got potentially even greater than the money that we've said that we were going to spend, because now it's no longer $10,000. It could be $11,000 or $12,000 we've already spent, an additional $1,000. As you can see, we're just spending more money for the same result. Spending the money, completing projects on time is actually going to be the best way for the association to actually save as much money as they can, not deferring them, not pushing them down the line.
And so, they say, can we do temporary repairs? It's too much to fix all at once. And at some point, it just has to be replaced. And, this constant cycle of band-aiding kicks the can down the road. The project gets more expensive. The project could increase in scope due to deterioration as a result of not being proactive. And sometimes, these Band-Aids are much more expensive. When we're going past the estimated useful life of the component, it sometimes gets very expensive just to Band-Aid. And it's understandable, because when we've sunk money into the repairs, we don't want to say, oh, okay, well, all of that was a waste and we just need to tear off the roof or what have you. But that's the reality. Once we've sunk those repairs, it doesn't really change the reality that we face on the ground, which is we can't keep throwing good money after bad. Let's bite the bullet and do this replacement. Now, status quo bias, right? People like things not to change. And that's managers, lawyers, board members, homeowners. And these projects, these large capital replacement projects, are scary. They can be risky. They can be disruptive to the community. So we just have to understand that people may resist the change of the disruption and all of the parking inconveniences, depending on what it is. We prefer things that are familiar, and Band-Aiding can be familiar. It just may not be cost effective. We talked a little bit about losing to construction costs, but there's also inflation, right? And when people talk about this, they say accurately, I can invest my money better than the association can. Or the alternative is, we'll just wait till the thing needs to be replaced, then just call me and I'll write the check.
Right. So again, you can see these are the questions that you get, right? We've already answered this. We've already answered the cost issues. Okay, fine. I still don't want to give money to the association because I know I can do better than the association can. The thing that we have to think about is that when we chose to live within an association, we now have an obligation to pay for our fair share of the usage of our assets while we live at that property. Therefore, if potentially you can get special assessed and you can handle it, are you sure your neighbor can? Because the obligation that you have when you chose to live within the association is to pay for your fair share. Also keep in mind that it's going to potentially cost money to then get the money in the first place. You have to have a vote. You have to get other people involved, particularly if you can't collect on those fees because some people can't afford it. It's going to now potentially cause more problems, more delays, could cause other issues that we're not aware of at the time we make our choice. And then again, remember, if we can't just write the check on time to get that project done, we have to maybe wait a year or wait for the next annual meeting to make this choice. We're still losing out. We're still losing time. In Colorado, for example, we can't just do a project, depending on what it is, in the dead of winter. You have to wait for the next summer to potentially do it. So we're just losing out. Another thing to keep in mind is for your owners, the cheapest and most equitable and fairest way to run your association's finances for the reserves are just going to be ongoing reserve transfers. So you can see here, I have reserve transfers on the left, a special assessment in the middle, and then a loan funding option on the farthest right. Even with 1% annual compounding interest, the association can save about $20,000 just with reserve transfers. And also keep in mind, that's over a 15-year time period. So not every single owner even has to pay the total 15 years, right? Some owners may move in, move out. So it's a much cheaper, affordable way of doing it. The $250,000 would be a special assessment. So one set of owners has to pay for all of that. And a loan, of course, is going to then cost the association more money over potentially a 7 or 6 year period, depending on what the loan deal pans out to be, because you have to pay the privilege of borrowing that money. So again, cheapest and most equitable way. Again, you may be able to manage your association's finances, or manage your own finances better than the association. But wouldn't you just also like to save money too, like not putting more money into the association than you have to? Well, the best way to do that is just going to be reserve transfers. But then they'll say to me, as you can see on the next slide, well, how does your reserve study help me? Because you just told me inflation is going to change from year to year. So all of the numbers on your reserve study are going to be wrong next year. And we say yes. And that's why we recommend annually updating your reserve study. Because if you wait just 3 years to update your reserve study relative to an association who's updating it every year, the association, by waiting 3 years, increases their special assessment risk by about 28%. If you wait 5 years to update your reserve study, you've now increased your risk of special assessment by 35%. Why is that? Well, because again, all the costs on your reserve study are going to be current costs, current data. We are calling roofing vendors, calling all the vendors for your property, getting the quotes, getting the costs in real time for your association's assets. Those bids for those items are generally 15 to 30 days, potentially, if that. They're good for that long. So 3 years down the line, those numbers are totally out the window.
Psychology is the illusion of control. When someone says, just tell me when I need to write the check and I'll write it. Those people never write the check, not ever, in my experience. And it costs money to raise money as an association. And so, we have to understand that people think they're experts in finances, and there are people who are CPAs or very good with their money. But then the conversation shifts to, but do you trust your neighbors to pay? Because if they don't, you're going to end up holding the bag as the person who can control their money. So we have to be aware of that. And as we reduce our trust, either by a homemade reserve study or not a clear reserve study or inadequate conversations with our owners, we find that the cooperation falls off an absolute cliff. And there's documented psychological studies for why that is. And part of this concept that we're talking about is that when everyone votes for their short-term self-interest, they can destroy the community's viability. And that's referred to as the tragedy of the commons, where we're all just worried about ourselves right now, and we don't fund the reserves, and then we find out that the association is in too deep a hole that it can effectively dig itself out of. Give to future owners is one of the most compelling arguments, I think, that we can make in reframing the issue of what reserve funds are actually for. And I call it the green banana syndrome, which is when someone or a group of owners say, I don't want to pay for future owners to use the elevator that we're about to pay to refurbish. I don't even buy green bananas because I may not be alive to eat them when they ripen. And that's a George Burns bit from years ago. But why should we pay for the benefit of future owners? We won't be here when the roof needs to be replaced.
And this response that we need to have to that sort of problem is reframing the question, or reframing the way that we look at reserve studies. We never say this is for the future, because again, we're going to have that green bananas issue. Rather, we want to frame the conversation as your reserves are paying for your usage while you live at the association. You're paying for the here and now, the ongoing deterioration of the association's components while you live here. You're not paying for someone else in the future. Rather, you're utilizing these components while you live here. Therefore, you have an obligation to pay for your fair share of these components while you live at the property.
Yeah. And that's just basically saying you're wearing it out now. And if you ever plan to sell, you're going to have a problem. We'll talk about impact on resale. But the psychology is hyperbolic discounting, which is and I talked about temporal discounting, but hyperbolic is is a dramatic decline in interest depending on how far out the future reward is. Pretty well documented in psychology. Let's talk about the impact at resale, Brian, and we'll take some questions.
Excellent.
I'll move out before we special assess. Maybe you won't. You might move out, but you probably won't sell.
Right. So, I mean, at least now we're getting to the final end game here of, okay, fine. I put my hands up. I'll get out of here. I don't want to be a part of this. I just don't want to pay. The thing is, we now have to be aware that more and more entities, institutions, other than just your HOA, are now interested in the association's finances. So it reminds me of 15 years ago, the response we got when we put roofs in Colorado in the reserve study. The response would be, well, we're just going to wait for the next hailstorm. Then that will take care of that, right? We won't fund for it. And these were legitimate responses I received. What we're finding is that more institutions are really interested. In fact, the largest kind of underwriter, which helps back most of the loans that occur in the United States, are now even putting guidelines in as far as what kind of deals they're going to take. Some of their guidelines for underwriting specific deals include the specific guidelines that a reserve study must be completed within at least 3 years of the time of the deal. A reserve study must be prepared by an independent person like a reserve specialist. And then that the reserve study must comment favorably on the age and condition of the property. Also, we've found that lower property values occur when an association is poorly funded. So it could be correlation and causation, right? Those things. But if you go to a well-funded community, most likely the things, the items, the aesthetics of the association are going to be in better condition because you're not having to defer, you're not having to wait. When those turbulent periods occur where they have heavy expenses, the association is able to fund for those replacements rather than just deferring or band-aiding or whatever it may be. So we do see an impact on the resale value of the homes. A well-funded association has about a 12% increase in the resale value because generally speaking, things are taken care of. Generally, there's less rumors of special assessments, and it's going to be a much smoother process for the association.
So to conclude, it's important business. It's worth doing properly. We don't have to win today. And, to the board members on the call that are concerned about rolling out bad news, an unsatisfactory or scary reserve study, talk to your manager, talk to your attorney if you need to. But it's information that the homeowners are entitled to get, and I think should morally have. And that doesn't make it your fault. If we ask owners to contribute more to reserves and they reject that, it's not a failure of you. It often will improve the association's legal position if people come back and want to make arguments that we didn't properly maintain something. Well, we couldn't because you didn't fund the corporation. And that's what I mean by being mindful of your emotional investments, which is board members have often the first look at the reserve study. They probably have a lot more context, hopefully, than the regular homeowner would have. And there's this stress, understandably, that comes with worrying about how are you going to start to make these reserve fund transfers. This is not your sole problem to solve. It's a community conversation. And we give owners the good information, access to the professionals, and they get to decide whether they want to fund it or not, depending on your state's laws and your governing documents. And if they choose not to, it's not your fault.
At Association Reserves, we make the present less stressful and the future more secure. If you'd like to join us in that mission, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment down below with what you'd like to see in a future webinar. Let's plan for your best future.